Welcome to my show. This is Abhinav Prakash and Abhijit. Thanks for coming again.
Well, thanks for having me.
So, Abhijit, when we talk about the Tejas, we have given the order for building of Tejas in the country, and that brings to this entire question of building a industrial military complex within India. So, what do you see the future in the next 10 to 15 years of an indigenous defense production in India? We also have defense corridors coming up in UP and also in Tamil Nadu. And especially when we talk about the this whole idea of in India of the offset and of the original equipment manufacturer, do you think that we have to have a rethink on those concepts if we really want to build up the defense capabilities?
Yeah, look, so the thing is, we will make some strides in defense indigenization in the next 10 years, in the next decade. But we definitely won't indigenize to the extent that people dream we will. So, after one of the reasons that the Tejas was meant to be operational by 1990s, it still wasn't operational by the 2000s. It wasn't operational by the 2010s. Finally, 40 years after its conception, half a century after its conception, it will be operational. It will be operational. A non-stealth fighter a non-stealth domestic fighter will be operational in the Indian Air Force about 2 to 3 years after America retired its first stealth fighter, which served the Americans for almost 40 years. Okay, that tells you how behind on the technology curve we are. Now, there are very simple things with this. One of the reasons it's taken so long is we decided to develop our own radar, we decided to develop our own engine. It took us almost 30 years to realize we couldn't develop a radar, we couldn't develop an engine. But why does it take you 30 years to realize you can't develop a radar and an engine?
But just
Uh,
who are we out here? Are you talking about HAL? HAL was deciding or trying to build all
India,
these
India period, India period.
India.
We is India. We are not HAL. I will never put, I'm sorry, I'm not stupid to call myself HAL.
No, no, no.
You have to
I'm
be
saying
particularly, no,
that.
you have to be particularly incompetent to classify yourself under HAL. HAL is kind of a byword for
So who
incompetence
was developing engine
and
and who was developing radar?
there were different components of the DRDO setup, that entire infrastructure. You can get into the specifics of which PSU was developing what. The thing is, it was a massive cluster failure. So you now have an American engine and you have an Israeli radar on it. Now, the thing is, you have accepted the fact that only about 40% or maybe 40 to up to 60, depending on the news report you read, is indigenous content. The rest of it is foreign content. You could have accepted this long back. Remember, the
Yes.
Navy accepted this so long back. You look at the Kolkata class frigates, Kolkata class destroyers, the Delhi class destroyers. The hull was built in India. The engine was always imported. The weapon systems were mostly imported. Why didn't the Air Force understand this? Given that an aircraft is a much more sophisticated thing. In a ship, you have about 150 meters worth of length and 17 meters width to fit in equipment. It doesn't need that kind of miniaturization. In an aircraft, you have to fit in a lot of the similar systems into something that is less than 1/100th the size, that requires immense miniaturization, and it has to be quadruplex redundancy. So every system has to be 4 times duplicated so that if one side gets shot, the other three work. Right. So there seems to be something in the Air Force that's very different. The Navy seems to have learned its lessons a lot quicker. Not that everything is optimal out there, but the Air Force seems to be learning it quite differently.
But I think that's a
Uh,
problem of the Indian mindset itself, because we are obsessed with this Swadeshi and building things in India. You look at when we are successfully now exporting mobile phones from India, but look at the people laugh at it. Oh, we are only assembling the mobile phone in India. They don't understand the supply chains, it seems.
Correct. And this is the thing. When I hear we're assembling it in India, remember, made in China mobile phone gets so much made out of China. It's made in Vietnam and places like that, imported into China. The Chinese assemble it and put it together and then export it out again. Those, and we should be happy to do that.
Yes.
Problem with Swadeshi and Atmanirbhar, sometimes when I hear them, the fear is that a lot of people don't even understand what that is. So the good thing is we've been smart enough to take on an Israeli radar and an American engine. The question is, where are we going to go from here? Okay, because we're still not creating enough economies of scale to manufacture an aircraft engine domestically. We're not creating enough economies of scale to manufacture that radar domestically. The Americans and Israelis have serious worries about our operational security, that they don't want to transfer the requisite technology to us. We don't produce ship engines. We still don't produce the armaments for ships locally here. There's a lot of issues there. So one of the things I've noticed is a lot of it comes because defense only thinks in the silo of defense. Okay. They don't look at economics. They don't look at the industrial strength of the country. And very often, because the government, government documents in India are so wonderfully confusing, they actually hide more than they tell you. It's a classic case of drinking your own Kool-Aid. Propaganda is meant for others. When you start believing your own propaganda, then you're screwed. The problem here is we tend to believe our own propaganda. What you need to do now is, if you want that technology accretion to happen, it's actually easier now because it happens mostly. Most of the huge technology changes actually happens at a micro level, at the micro, medium, small enterprise level. And that's a very, very good opportunity for India to get involved out there. Sadly, we're not seeing it. And some of the language you see, offset, OEM, original equipment manufacturer, dude, it shows you that the person even writing the document doesn't know what they're talking about, because there is no such thing as an original equipment manufacturer anymore. This is 70s jargon. In the 70s, Boeing used to manufacture about 90% of its own plane. Today, you're lucky if Boeing manufactures even 20% of its own plane. The remaining 80% comes from abroad and from a whole net of 20, 30, 40,000 suppliers, right? Spread across the globe. A large part of the Dreamliner, for example, is made in Japan. One of the reasons the F-35 program is seen as a global program is because large parts of it, 30, 40% of it, is actually made abroad, right? So it's a very complex ecosystem that needs to be taken in. Also, remember, offset is fundamentally a code word for corruption. The correct word to use is work share. Offset money kya hota hai ki in the Middle East, and UAE has moved on. But what UAE used to do was, instead of paying 100% of the price, they would pay 200% of the price, and the remaining 100% would be given back to you, to some sheikh's uncle or sheikh's nephew or sheikh's nephew ka beta ka beti ki damad, for pretending that they were actually doing value addition and things like that. Ghar jamai ko paisa dena padta tha. So you used to pay 200%. That is what
You're subsidizing the domestic incompetence.
you are subsidizing domestic.
Just like in this case, the key offset should go to HAL.
Correct. Whereas work share means you only pay 100% of the price, and in return, 50% comes to local companies because they are globally competitive and they get integrated into global supply chains. Right? So you have people, and I've actually been to defense conferences where I've actually seen local manufacturers not understand this. They have an inferiority complex about their own products, which are actually quite good. So we have a long way to go, because the words you use determines your mindset. Do you remember we had this conversation about how ancient Greeks couldn't see blue?
Yeah.
And it wasn't that they couldn't see blue. It's not that color developed with human evolution in the last 2000 years. It's because the name blue hadn't been coined. It's only after you coin the name blue that it becomes more apparent to you, and you then start seeing shades of blue. So it's like that. You have to move from this OEM to integrated manufacturing mindset, from offsets towards work share and things like that. It's a huge mental change. So even that has to change. I'm watching if it changes in this decade. I'm optimistic. That's an unusual word for me to use. I'm optimistic that it might. I fear it might not.
Mhm. Uh, uh, no, I think people will love to see the optimistic Abhijit. But when we talk about, no, we often hear this thing from Indians, Indian political class especially, from the panchayat level neta to the top level political leaders of this country, that we are the country of 1.4 billion and so on. We can build our own fighter plane, we can build our own tanks, we can build our own missiles and navy ships because we have 1.4 billion, we can do it. How do you see that?
Uh, France is what, 60, 70 million people. Bangladesh is almost 200 million people. Indonesia is about 250 million people. Have you seen Indonesia built its own fighter, tank, submarine, nuclear bomb, nuclear submarine? No. Has Bangladesh been able to build it? No. Does France build it at just 60 to 70 million people? Yes. So going by this argument technically, Bangladesh should be more advanced than France. Indonesia should be more advanced than France. Why is it that tiny little Israel has at least 10 to 15% defense components in almost every single foreign aircraft, tank, or ship around? Right? You look at any plane, the F-35 has Israeli components in it. Most French products will have some Israeli components in it. Most Swedish products will have some Israeli component in it. Why? Most, not all, most. A lot of them will, because there's a global supply chain. It depends on what your technology is and so on and so forth. So this thing that somehow just because we have the biggest population, you can produce things is simply not true. You take the Western market, and by the Western market I mean NATO, so USA, Canada plus Western Europe, plus Australia, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, all those countries. You're looking at a total population of 1.1 billion people with a per capita income averaging 43,000 US dollars. Okay, 1.1 billion isn't that far away from 1.4 billion, except that 1.4 billion have just $2,000 per capita. Okay, which is to say that the West can spend 20 times as much in your education than India can. And there's a very simple thing. So, for example, every time we studied nuclear diplomacy in India, we didn't even know what the inside of a nuclear reactor looked like. In the West, when I went just for a fellowship, the University of New Mexico had a nuclear reactor, an experimental nuclear reactor, which students could go perform experiments. So we were actually taken in and we were allowed to do experiments out there, nuclear experiments on an actual reactor, right? That is what that 20x difference in human spending makes. That is what makes you a technology giant. Just reproducing like rabbits just makes you rabbits. It doesn't make you a superpower. If numbers made superpowers, then mosquitoes would be the dominant species on Earth, or actually viruses and bacteria would be the dominant species on Earth, not human beings.
Fair point. So basically, we have to understand the economies of scale. We have to understand that instead of going for this offset kind of political rhetoric, we have to move towards work share and the work participation model. That's interesting, Abhijit. So, Abhijit, in the case of Balakot strike, we have seen that India basically called the bluff of the Pakistan, the nuclear bluff of the Pakistan. So, how do you see this nuclear standoff between India, Pakistan, and China unfolding in the future? And will that have, defining impact on how the wars will be fought in the coming decades? Because I think we have just opened up a window of limited war under the nuclear overhang. How true is that?
So this was something that was discussed very often by the Pakistanis. We should actually thank the Pakistanis for this, that they went on insisting that war, limited war under the nuclear umbrella is possible, right? And they proved it literally 1 year after we had Operation Shakti, when they invaded Kargil, for all effects and purposes, occupied Kargil, and they thought they were being too smart by half, right? Since then, what we've shown them is that we can actually conduct a fairly deep strike inside Pakistan. Now, remember, the idea of nuclear deterrence is almost like a nation state. It's an imagined identity or an imagined myth in that sense, which you need to keep in place in order to hold up this myth of nuclear deterrence. Remember, the UK was a nuclear power when Argentina attacked the Falkland Islands and took it over, right? Similarly, there is a lot of uh, evidence to show that it wasn't the nuclear weapons by themselves that led to Japan's surrender to America. It was actually a combination of events. The Soviets having declared war, the fear of the they any day preferred an American occupation to a Soviet occupation. The fact, amazingly, the fire bombings that the Allies carried out, that the Americans carried out of Tokyo, killed more people than the nuclear bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So, it wasn't as straightforward as we're led to believe that nuclear deterrence prevents war. And you've also seen, of course, North Korea, right? With North Korea, you've seen how many provocations they do against everybody. Uh, uh, South Korea is technically under the American nuclear umbrella, yet the North Koreans will go sink a South Korean ship. Remember the Chonan incident where they sank a South Korean frigate and things like that. And there's very little you can do. Similarly, the Chinese keep challenging Japanese sovereignty over the Diaoyu Islands, Senkaku in Japanese islands, and Japan is technically under under the American nuclear umbrella. Similarly, the Chinese and Indians, we have exchanged blows in Galwan, as you see, and that's also been under the nuclear umbrella. So what we're realizing is it's also quite dangerous in that sense, because you're slowly creating a bigger and bigger and bigger gap of action under the nuclear umbrella, and you really don't know when somebody is going to go pop. The real secret is, how much can you hurt a nuclear country without making it panic? Because a nuclear first strike is essentially a panic reaction, in the sense where you fear that your conventional forces are going to get crushed. Then you respond with a nuclear strike. It is to prevent conventional failure. So it's very important that we understand that. And air power, once upon a time, air power used to be seen as a very imprecise instrument, like the firebombing of Dresden, which killed off so many Germans. The Allied raids on Tokyo, for example, that again killed off so many people. So it was seen as very imprecise. Today, air power has become so precise. You saw with the way terrorists get taken out. You can literally target a jeep, one jeep in a convoy of 10 to 15 jeeps. You can precisely target it. In that sense, it's almost one of the reasons we worship Ganesha. And he's seen as the lord of discrimination in the sense fine distinction, great nuance, is because the trunk of an elephant is strong enough that it can uproot a tree, but it is also so fine that it can pick up a single blade of grass. And that is invariably what air power is becoming today. It can inflict both a lot of damage and it can do extreme precision strike as well. So that's a very important aspect. Again, air power is enabling, and precision strike, even naval or ground precision strike, is enabling a huge amount of latitude in terms of opening up the war space under the nuclear umbrella.
But coming to India and Pakistan, what is their current nuclear doctrine? Because India has also made certain statements in the past that we are ready to rethink the first use doctrine, or this doctrine does not apply to the nuclear powers. And what is the Pakistan's posture now after Balakot?
See, unfortunately, in India, people don't realize this, but we have an extremely indisciplined a form of government and an extremely indisciplined setup of the National Security Council. So you had the former National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon create a lot of mischief when he used this term "no first strike against non-nuclear states," implying that you will have a first strike against nuclear states, with officially violated your doctrine. But see, the point here is very simple. Everybody who knew how the Manmohan Singh government was working knew that Manmohan Singh didn't have any power and Shiv Shankar Menon had even lesser power. He was trying to carve out a space for himself, right? So All these kind of statements were necessary to keep giving attention to him, even when the foreign ministry and defense ministry would just deny his requests for information. They just flat out blackball him every time he asked for information. Since this government took over, they've actually been slightly more careful, but not that much more careful. Because what happened was the BJP, before its 2014 victory, issued a statement saying we will relook the no first strike, no NFU in the no first use in the nuclear doctrine. They didn't do that. They haven't revised the doctrine, which in itself is quite a bad sign, because every French president is required to restate the nuclear doctrine when he or she takes office, which in India isn't. We're still laboring under a 2001 document. People believe it's the 1998 document that is the nuclear doctrine. It is not. That was merely an advisory paper. The 2001 statement of cabinet that came out is the official doctrine. And for the last 20 years, we have not revised the doctrine, which is highly problematic. Okay, it actually reduces deterrence, because deterrence has many components. It has the validity of your technology, which is called technological deterrence. It's called human deterrence, which is your leadership willing to use the nuclear weapon? And Manmohan Singh said, what point is a nuclear weapon, which really eroded your human deterrence massively. You can't have leaders saying, making statements like that. Then you have there's several kinds of several things that go into the credibility of your deterrent in that sense. So there was that aspect. And then what happened was Manohar Parikarji, when he was minister, raised some purely theoretical points during the book launch of Gurmeet Singh's book, the late General Gurmeet Singh's book in IDSA. And again, the nuclear does not come under the defense minister. It comes under the PMO. The only person realistically who is allowed to make a statement on this is the PM. Because understand, even the National Security Advisor, when you read the 2001 doctrine, the National Security Advisor only carries out the attack. He has no ability to decide the targets. He has no ability to decide the doctrine. He is not empowered to decide the doctrine. He is not empowered to decide the targets. He is empowered to do nothing except carry out the strike. Okay, the only person empowered to decide the targets, the doctrine, the structure is the Prime Minister. And to date, no Prime Minister has made a statement except for Manmohan Singh saying what use is a nuclear weapon. Okay. As far as I'm concerned, but the way foreign academia works is unko dhanda chalana hai na, unless they have something new to say every 15 seconds, because tenure depends on how many peer-reviewed papers you produce. So they will try to see profundity and meaning where none exists. So you'll see a lot of this garbage come up.
But what of Pakistan's nuclear position now after Balakot?
Their position hasn't changed. So, they have something called 4 thresholds, which is the economic threshold. If we cause too much economic damage on them, they will go nuclear, first use. They believe in a nuclear first strike. They believe in using tactical weapons. They don't call them tactical weapons. They call them low yield, short range weapons, which are used on a battlefield. But for them, it's an economic threshold, a military threshold. So if we destroy too much of their military, and mind you, this is the key phrase, too much of their military. So you can destroy significant parts of their military without it being too much of their military, and they still won't use nuclear weapons. They have a geographic threshold, which is you can capture some territory, but if you capture too much territory, they will go nuclear, right? And the 4th one, I forget now.
Basically, we can capture Kashmir.
Uh, if we manage to, but Kashmir is a horribly difficult battlefield. It's lots of valleys, up, down, heavily forested. That's like getting into a Vietnam-like situation. It's a lot worse than Vietnam, much higher mountains and things not advisable. So even with Pakistan, there's been no change. But remember, the Pakistani arsenal isn't simply to deter India. It's also a blackmail tool to get the West to keep investing in Pakistan to prevent its collapse as a state.
Yes.
Right. So the blackmail function of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal is probably more significant, and they need to make a credible threat against India so that West takes Pakistan more seriously and prevents it from becoming a failed state. That's the main use. It's think of it as an oblique attack. It's actually meant to be attacking. It's actually meant for a different purpose, but the stated purpose and the drama is all directed towards it.
Interesting, Abhijit. Interesting. So, Abhijit, how do you see the Indian defense sector unfolding in the coming decade, especially when seen from the prism of information warfare and also the war fighting doctrine? Did we learn any lesson from the Balakot standoff and the other kind of the information warfare which is going on at the moment against India, even in this farmers' protest?
Right. So, one of the things is as you keep going up the technology ladder, the great thing about technology is it enables you to save lives. Right. Now, there's two components of it. One is the more advanced weapons, but the much more important thing is the whole intelligence complex that goes into it. Before, you used to win wars just using weapons. Today, you win wars using intelligence. The weapon is just the last sort of tip of the spear, so to say. So, what happens in this is one of the things we learned from Balakot, and you can see the transition happen from the so called surgical strike after Uri to the airstrike after Balakot. Why? Because it helped you go in much, much deeper into Pakistan proper, not even into disputed territory, but Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and precision bomb something out there. So this is a very, very important thing that people are learning. And I don't think people understand this, but when you bombed that terrorist camp in Balakot, what you did was you killed their train the trainer program. So the group out there, they're going to have to take at least 3 to 4 years to recuperate, because you have to depute more trainers from the Pakistan army. That was sort of a master's in terrorism course that they were running out there. So it's like, imagine taking out a whole master's class for a whole year, right? So you have to rebuild that entire cadre all over again. So the stuff that you can achieve is disproportionate. It's a non-linear method of war. See, linear is when force on force. Here, tum kya kar rahe ho? Using air power, you're going like so and hitting at the back. So it's no longer a linear course of action. Now, the issue with this is, and this is something India still hasn't gotten the hold of, is that a victory like this is tactically great. Like, see, in Bangladesh, the victory is tactically great, but unless you also accompany it with the information victory, Pakistan feels undefeated, right? So, in the case of 71, you can say we had 90,000 prisoners of war, but they'll always say, see, you defeated us in the East, but you couldn't defeat us in the West, right? Here, what they'll say is everybody knows that they've lost about 70 to 80 terrorists minimum in that Balakot strike, but they will claim, Dekho, tumne, you just bombed some trees and killed a crow. Okay, that is not the case. The issue is, and this is very, very important, we have not yet, we have moved to a technology paradigm of warfare, which fundamentally means that you've moved towards air war. It's called air centrism. The problem is you still haven't accumulated the entire system of systems, the intelligence, the fusing of intelligence with real-time combat data, multiple sources in the air and things like that. In this case, you couldn't even get battle damage verification. Now, this was happening a lot with the Saudis in Yemen, where they would bomb the same airfield, the exact same spot 4 times a day. And the joke that came about was that because King Salman had still does have advanced Alzheimer's, he used to keep forgetting what he bombed in the morning. So he'd order it to be bombed again in the afternoon, and then at 6 p.m. in the evening, and then at 8 p.m. at night. So that kind of intelligence and battle damage assessment is absolutely critical so that you don't waste resources. Let me explain this in a simple way. I think it was Shashi Tharoor who once said about farmers' funds dispersal and the rot in storage, that we lose in storage twice what, lose as much wheat in storage per year, twice the amount of what Australia produces in a year. And when you don't have intel, so why? Because you don't have a stores management system, you don't have a grain management system, you don't know grain kahan se aa raha hai, kitne, how long it is there, कब सड़ रहा है, when it's rotting and things like that. So you need to have that kind of a system in place, and it is automatic. See, we've automatically moved from an army-centric, a ground-centric view to an air-centric view, and slowly you will move towards an intelligence and data fusion centric interpretation of warfare. Now, why is that important in terms of what we're seeing in the farmers' protest? The farmers' protest is classic information age warfare that you see, right? The way to nip it in the bud was to prevent. See, the moment people congregate, the PR game is already lost, right? I've said this many times in Kashmir as well. The moment things happen in Kashmir, your PR game is lost. Uske baad, they will continue to throw stones at you, and then no matter what happens, it is always innocent people, so-called innocent people, who get hit with pellet guns and so on and so forth. So when you get into the intelligence game, you realize that intelligence that is used for air can also be easily used on ground intelligence, for counterterrorism intelligence and things like that. It almost becomes a necessity. You're forced to do it in that sense. So what happens is you will slowly start getting into information warfare paradigms even on the ground. Better late than never. We are quite late to the thing, but you will see where we get to an intelligence phase where we are able to nip these protests right at the bud. Uh, Gauge their intent. If it is peaceful, allow it to happen. If they intend mischief, to nip it even before they congregate. There are many things like this. It's slowly, and see, it's happening as and when your per capita income increases. Because countering information age warfare is a very first world tactic in that sense. So the more your per capita income and human capital increases, the more your ability to deal with these things increases. The question is, where is your anthropological standard meeting your technology standard? Right now, the accepted technology standard is there. Your anthropological and human standard is here. So we'll always be behind the curve, but slowly, you will keep catching up.
Okay, that's a very interesting perspective because how the war is being waged now has a very important element of information warfare, and we have seen that in the case of the CAA protest and also in the case of the farmers' protest, where the people are protesting on the ground for something else, but the narrative in social media, in the international media, is something completely entirely different. But thank you, Bijit, for joining us, and we hope to listen to you on different aspects because these are the things which we are really not discussing in the mainstream media and the mainstream forums. So thank you, Abhijit.
Well, very well.